Good afternoon, this is Richard Gomez, and I'm talking today about white privilege in America and where this attitude stemmed from. I believe this attitude stems from human history. In human history, I believe people have naturally tried to find a way to distinguish themselves from one another, ultimately building up hierarchies including religion, power, education, the ability of just exercising their military might over one another. So we have this idea that eventually culminates in the concept of divine right of kings. You know, the king has appointed the rulers over you. In every culture, you have at least every culture I know of, you have the Aztecs, the Egyptians, the Europeans. You have a king or a monarchy that somehow positions himself as God's representative on earth. So the divine right of kings is very well established. And I think what we have here in America is the same attitude, just without the kings. So they remove themselves from under this oppressive program of religion and government or the empire. So they no longer, they definitely no longer accepted the notion of divine right of kings, but I think within their hearts they still kept the attitude of their divine right as a people. So God was still guiding them, God was still directing them, and they were the chosen few, if you will. And so when they arrived to America, or they began to establish themselves in the new land, it was easy for them to see themselves as the ones that were favored of God, favored by destiny, the divine destiny, or manifest destiny, to take the land, even to subjugate the people that were already here, and to attempt to even import others that were more easily subjugated, since they were coming from taken out of their homeland and brought into a completely new land, completely disorientating them, stripping them of any kind of identity. That's what the African Americans went through. So we see this unfortunate event accumulating in America, where the worst examples of hierarchy is maintained along racial lines, not even along class, as far as wealth or knowledge. It actually prides itself on the exclusive, making knowledge exclusive to one versus over another. So the first example of this we can see is this pattern every step of the way in American history, at least at its initial stages, is in 1790, naturalization. The Naturalization Act stated specifically that in order to become a United States citizen, you had to be white and of good character. So obviously, or apparently, you can be white and not of good character, but in order to be of good character, you had to also be white. It seemed to make no allowances for good character outside of whiteness. And so that just proves my point that I believe that European white people decided that this was their land. This was their chance to experiment. This their chance to establish something unique in the world. You know, a modern world of what they believed to be equality. All men created equal. But then it was up to them to define exactly who all men were. The next step was, in the midst of slavery, the question became whether or not a free black person could become a U.S. citizen. And the answer was resoundingly no. So 1850 was established that you could live in America, you could be a black person, you could be freed based on the 1863 Emancipation Act, but still forever be labeled or maintained as something less than a full-blooded American U.S. citizen. So that left you as a perpetual foreigner in your own land. I believe these acts perpetuate the notion then of being less than the other, one person being superior to another. This was clearly a white nation, and white people were the only legitimate people here. This continued even into the 1930s and the 1940s. You can see it in the housing programs. The Federal Housing Administration was an act was put in place in order to create housing for Americans, affordable housing for average Americans, low class, lower to middle class, upper middle class income families could afford a house. Fortunately, the government divided the property value based on race. The red areas here depict the most populated by races. Actually, they labeled it hazardous areas. Ironically, the further out you go to the more modern homes, further away from the cities, where both whites and minorities had risen in their capital, their incomes had risen, and would pursue newer homes, those were considered declining, automatically declining by federal regulations. Even further out, you still had areas with some minorities, but not that many, were considered still desirable. Still desirable. Even though they were the newest homes, they were considered still desirable. The best were the newest homes. Finally coming to the newest homes were still desirable, not because they were the newest homes, but because there were no minorities in them at all. So the single qualifying factor for the value of property was the amount of whiteness in it. And the single factor that would depreciate property was the amount of minorities in the area. So this obviously led to discrimination. You could not buy a house in the red area, at least not covered by this act. And you were discouraged or prohibited from buying a house in the suburbs because you would automatically bring the value of the property down. My own parents in 1968 bought their first house, and this is the year that the Fair Housing Act went into place. I don't know if that directly applied to it, but my parents just told me recently that, and I remember hearing this earlier too, that they had problems trying to buy a house. And some neighborhoods just would not excel to them, would not accept them. I had always assumed this was just a people on a human level being discriminatory. I did not know, however, that there were actual policies in place that made this happen. So you can see the results today where you have our grandparents, my grandparents, who bought their home. My grandparents, for example, were not able to sell their home. If they had stayed in the house that they originally bought, we bought a number of houses since then. But even the house that they ended up passing away in is worthless today. Absolutely worthless. There's no value in that part of town. So you can see the results, whereas if my grandparents were white and they were able to buy a house in the suburbs, well, that house would have been able to fund my parents or my college tuition in a nice college and with a second mortgage. And even by the time they were ready to retire, that house would have been paid for and able to provide them a nice retirement. So there is a definite inequality among racial lines in America due to specific policies. And I believe these policies contribute to poverty along racial lines and malcontent. That's all the time I have. Thank you very much.